Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Friday, May 15th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode, a family farm in Moses Lake fighting the Department of Ecology for more than 9 years. And now they're waiting to find out if the state Supreme Court is going to take up their case over water rights. This is an issue that has cost them a lot of health and a heck of a lot of money, nearly $1 million in the last 9+ years. Then Howard Schultz no longer holding back in his criticisms of Washington's anti business policies. And he's going after Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson. It was an op ed this week in the Wall Street Journal. You may have seen some reporting on that. I also have a somewhat moderate member of the Seattle City Council weighing in on his concerns about Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson's sort of flippant dismissal. Bye bye, wealthy. Bye bye, business interests in Seattle. If you're going to leave, kind of so long, who cares? He doesn't see it quite that way. And he's very concerned about the message that that is sending. And then my colleagues, Tim Clauser and TJ Martinell, on Spokane's ever evolving policy changes in response to the homelessness and drug crisis in that community. Some in that city have been working for months to move away from a housing first approach where you don't have to quit using and abusing. We'll just give you a house and that'll fix everything, to a treatment first approach. It seemed they were moving that direction until this week when that all fell apart. So that's what's coming up in today's episode of Washington in Focus. We'll start with Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz and his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. You may recall earlier this week, Starbucks cut some more jobs at their Seattle headquarters, and Schultz then came out blasting the city's leadership, accusing the mayor of basically pushing socialist rhetoric, that was his term, and vilifying businesses. He said Seattle's Mayor Katie Wilson has chosen to cast business as a foil rather than a partner. Now, you may recall back in March of this year, Schultz came out and said, my wife and I we're out. We've already moved to Florida. And he kind of cited some like early retirement moves and family motivations, which may well be the case, but it was odd timing. Of course, that was just right before or right as the millionaire's tax was being debated in Olympia. So a lot of people took that, for his timing of announcing that to say, really, are you saying this now? Maybe because you don't think that the income tax is a good idea. Well, in his op-ed this week, he made clear that that's kind of what he meant. And he was concerned about the mounting tax and regulation climate, the anti-business climate in the state of Washington. He mentioned how Governor Ferguson and majority Democrats have emphasized taxation rather than reform. And he believes it's backfiring. He's seeing it. And I'm sure in the circles of people that he's associated with, he knows full well what's going on. So I'm going to put up this graphic and show you part of what he had to say in that op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. He was talking about the Microsoft, Amazon, Boeings of the world that have created such incredible opportunities for people to make a better than a living wage in the state of Washington. But then he said that ecosystem worked because risk taking was rewarded, growth was possible, and civic leadership, while imperfect, understood that private enterprise was not the adversary of the public good. It was one engine for improving the public sphere. Went on to say that ecosystem is fractured today. Seattle and much of Washington face serious problems: chronic homelessness, disorder in core business districts, persistent budget deficits, declining public school outcomes, and a slowing technology hiring cycle. He's very concerned about how the state is responding to those things. So if you haven't checked out that op-ed, which I think came out Tuesday of this week in the Wall Street Journal, I would encourage you to do so. He also talked about the high crime rate. Even though some more serious felony crimes, murder and the rape and the like, have gone down, property crimes and vandalism, those numbers and lower level crimes have just shot through the roof. And then, of course, there's lax prosecution for any of those lower level crimes, not just in Seattle, but statewide. So, very interesting that Schultz timing comes out now, as many other prominent business leaders have also been coming out with their resistance to the income tax. And I spoke last week to Seattle City Councilman, probably the most moderate member of the left leaning council, Bob Kettle, about the business exodus. Again, you recall Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson took a lot of flack when she recently, waved kind of a flippant goodbye to the wealthy and to, business that would decide to relocate because of the income tax, kind of dismissing those legitimate concerns. Well, Kettle, again, probably the most moderate member of the council, he told me in our interview, he thinks that's a really bad way to respond to these legitimate concerns.
I have serious concerns, and so much that I have an op-ed that was in the not too long ago, maybe 6, 8 weeks ago, in the Puget Sound Business Journal. I am seriously concerned because we do not live on an island. There's a concept called regulatory arbitrage, and when we have a situation where we have the East Side jurisdictions, Bellevue and the like, and it is too easy to move to the other side, we cannot be ignorant of that. We cannot be looking away from that. And we need to be smart and pragmatic in our approach. I support business. And by the way, the political kind of thing is to say small business, but no, it's the entire ecosystem, because even small businesses rely on large businesses. Amazon is headquartered in my district. I know small businesses that were having a hard time during the pandemic because of the remote work, that they had to shut down. And so we need to be pragmatic and smart about this and engaging, and don't think that we live on an island. So we need to be looking at our fiscal and tax policy, because for every action, there's a reaction. And this applies to tax policy as well. And so we need to be smart so that we don't, basically cut our nose to spite our face. That, we have to be prudent in terms of what we're doing. We have to think strategically long term and not just look for the short term quick fix, and which was highlighted in a recent editorial from the Seattle Times regarding Olympia. Because everything in that editorial from the Seattle Times that was talking about Olympia also applies to Seattle in one way or the other. And we have our equivalents. And so we need to be mindful of that. We need to be pragmatic, and we have to have a long-term strategic vision and of what we're doing on tax policy. And so I welcome having Starbucks in our city, Amazon, all the other countries. I have tech, I have Google, I have Meta, Facebook, I have Expedia, Tableau. All these companies are here. And then there's the traditional companies. I support having them there, because at the end of the day, as I said earlier, we have to set our business up for success too. As I said earlier, my goal is to set up individuals, organizations up for success. In the long term, they're the ones who create the revenue that we use in order to lead with compassion for those that are on the streets. But it's critical, and that we also look out for our neighborhoods, but also to our communities, to include our business communities. Because if we don't also look out for our neighborhoods and those various communities, to include the business communities, long term, we're not going to be there for our people.
So clearly, he is concerned about the sort of anti-business, entrepreneur, tax the rich policy and direction, the whole tone, not just in the city of Seattle, but the state of Washington. Unfortunately, on the council, he's probably the only member, at least that I've heard publicly at this point, being willing to call that out. Now, to our next issue in today's episode. More than 9 years after a legal battle began between a Grant County family farm and the Washington State Department of Ecology, those two sides are waiting to find out if the state Supreme Court is going to take up the case. This is a fight for Ron and Robin Fody and Fody Family Farms around water use on their farmland, which is just outside of Moses Lake. While Ecology, on the other side, contends the family had no right to tap into what they consider to be a vulnerable aquifer. So here is part of my conversation late on Thursday with Ron and Robin Fody.
The real issue is, did the DOE provide us technical assistance so we could do what they would like us to do.
Meaningful technical assistance.
Yeah, not a phone call that says cease and desist or
Turn off the water.
turn off the water.
Too late. It's too late. So that's a lot of misleading information.
Yeah.
And the law says that they're supposed to help us comply with the law by giving us technical assistance, written and oral, either way. And it says specifically, we never got written technical assistance. And I've talked to the author of the RCW 90.03.605, John Stuhlmiller. He was the Washington State Farm Bureau president at the time. He said he wrote that bill into place, so he knew exactly what we were talking about. And he said he and his team finessed the wording in there to hold the DOE or the government accountable. So he was really upset that they weren't following the law like they were supposed to. And I was trying to come into compliance because I knew there would be fines. And with all the certificates that we had and all the acreage to move and all that I was doing, I even have been quoted to say, surely we can work something out. There's got to be something that works here.
Because of this, we had a family meeting this winter and we said, this is 9 years. And when you've got over $1 million almost in attorney fees, we can't get out of this. And we had a meeting, and at that meeting, we explained to the kids. So we have one son, Peyton, who is Pearson's one of his older brothers, has stepped in to pay some bills. And Pearson has stepped in to help us with house payments, insurance, other bills, because
some of the lawyers' fees too.
That never ends. And it's not like you can get out of this. If they can't get us on the main issue, then they're going to cut you by 1,000 cuts to see whatever will stick, right?
Right. They either want to win by attrition, where I run out of money, or possibly die. I've had 7 heart attacks
during this time
and other medical issues, and you can't say that this stress on us is easy. So they keep taking my life and my livelihood away from me because they just choose to not follow the law.
Now, earlier today, I did receive a response from the Washington State Department of Ecology, not really commenting on where things are now, 9+ years later, but sending me a 2017 news release when they initially issued more than $600,000 in fines against this family. And they said, we issued the cease and desist orders, but the Fodies continued to tap into that aquifer. Here's part of what they sent me in that, again, release from 2017. The Odessa aquifer has been rapidly declining since 1980. Groundwater has dropped more than 200 feet, forcing local farmers and homeowners to drill wells deeper to reach the diminishing water supply. And they characterize the Fodies' continued water use as willfully ignoring the law and tapping into this vulnerable aquifer. Now, of course, the Fodies deny that accusation and say that ecology are the ones that are in the wrong here. They cite a state law, I believe it was passed in 2007, because of some of these water issues in that part of our state. But it was you can't tap into some of these aquifers, or you can all these certain times of the year based on what water supply looks like. But ecology in turn has to work with these family farmers and try to help them come into full compliance. And the Fodies contend that ecology did not do that. Now, this has really kind of bankrupted them after all this time. The mounting fines, the legal fees, I cannot even imagine, but it's been close to $1 million, they told me. And when you get in that tight of a spot, the bank doesn't look too favorably on you when you want to take out a loan that year for that year's growing season before you're going to get the payoff on the other end with the crop. If you're in a lengthy battle with the state, not likely too many banks want to work with you. And that has been the case for them. They've had to rely a lot on their adult children. And one of their sons is Pearson Fody. He is an LA actor and model. He was on that Disney show Jessie. If you ever watched that, it was kind of interesting. I showed my daughters a picture of Pearson after our conversation yesterday, and they both said, I know who he is. So I didn't know the name, but I now got to learn a little bit more about Pearson. He's very concerned about his parents and devastated, really, at the cost on them for this battle over the last 9+ years.
Yeah, it's brutal. It's brutal to see our entire legacy wiped away over essentially a secretarial error, and a moment that could have been resolved over a single conversation. I think that's extremely disappointing. You know, my parents pay taxes, I pay taxes, you pay taxes, and our taxes are now going towards attacking the people that are paying for, safety. And it's disheartening because we have to trust the government that they have our best interests at heart, and they just in this situation they don't. Um, and it's so insane because my life in LA is completely different, but it never stops being about the farm. This is my whole childhood was raised there, and to see it all completely taken away from us over the last 10 years it's insane. Um, and more than that, it's really difficult to see your parents go through something so challenging. And my parents are awesome. Like mom and dad are fantastic because really don't show it. They don't show it to their friends. They don't show it to us kids. They really keep it to themselves. And I think that's been one of their strongest points. But recently, when we did have our conversation, I think my my goal with getting out into the press and using my somewhat of my little bit of notoriety is to help get the word out there, because there is strength in numbers. There is strength in a little bit of public pressure. Public opinion does sway the court of personal opinion. And I think that has a powerful effect on the people that are listening and watching, because it's not just about us and our water rights. This is about family farms all over America, all over the world.
So now the wait is on to find out if, in fact, the Washington State Supreme Court is going to take up their petition to review this case. It has gone back and forth for all of these years. The Fodies have won some of these court battles. The state has won others. They expect a response from the Supreme Court probably in about a month, the middle of June, they told me, and then it's likely to be a year or more before then arguments would take place. So still quite a while before this is completely resolved. And then they told me if they win at the state Supreme Court, they fully expect ecology to appeal then to the Ninth Circuit. So this is likely to have far-reaching consequences, not just for their family farm, of course, but for farmers across Washington state. And a pretty important case when it comes to water rights. It's an issue that, they're not alone in dealing with. And now an effort to transition Spokane from housing first to treatment first, a model to address the homelessness and drug addiction crisis. That was moving ahead in Spokane until this week, when it kind of fell apart, when some of the region's most powerful players said they're not going to go along with this. Quick reminder, the housing first approach to all the people on the street, the drug addicts on the street, is to say, if they all have a house, then we can encourage them into getting clean and sober. Model hasn't really worked very successfully here or really any other place across the country, but many cities are still hanging on to that as the most compassionate approach. Others say the treatment first approach is the direction we've got to move into, because if you don't force these folks to get clean in exchange for housing and other supports and services, they're never going to make that decision because they're lost in the cycle of addiction. So here's a breakdown on that story, written by my colleague Tim Klauser this week, along with my colleague TJ Martinell. Here's part of what they put together this week.
Welcome to this episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is our reporter, Tim Klauser. And there's an effort to transition Spokane from housing first to treatment first model for addressing homelessness. And it's running into some snags. Tim, what's going on?
Yeah, so there was an effort. Some are saying that effort is now over. Others are saying that it may continue, but it's on pause for right now. But essentially, About a year ago, in August of 2025, President Donald Trump, just weeks earlier, had released this executive order condemning housing first, which is this practice we see in addressing homelessness where government organizations will prioritize giving homeless individuals taxpayer subsidized housing without any preconditions like sobriety or participating in treatment. Now, they say it's evidence-based. It's been in place for years, and the amount of homelessness has just increased over time. So people are arguing that, maybe we should change towards a treatment first approach instead of spending all this money on housing with people refusing to go into treatment or not complying with those conditions. Let's get them into treatment first and then get them into housing afterwards and help them address what the critics or some of these other players might call the root cause of homelessness. So after that executive order came out last year, this group in Spokane County, a commercial property developer, Sheldon Jackson, Chud Wendell, the executive director of the Hudson settlement, you had the Spokane County prosecutor, the sheriff, and a few others. They put together this memorandum of understanding, which was non-binding. It didn't commit any funding. It was essentially just this regional agreement that they wanted everyone in the county to sign, all the jurisdictions. So the small towns, the little cities, and then you have the main three players, Spokane County, the city of Spokane, and the city of Spokane Valley. They wanted everyone to sign it and essentially say, hey, we're going to emphasize treatment first. We want to get people into treatment. We're kind of straying away from housing first. This is going to be the direction we go forward. This is going to be kind of the basis of how we go about enforcement and spending our resources on addressing homelessness. By last October, they had a draft put together and started circulating it. They got almost everyone in the county, all these jurisdictions, to sign on, except those main three players, the city of Spokane, Spokane Valley, and Spokane County. And those three are largely responsible for submitting these federal applications for funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So they didn't sign it. So now there's this concern that, HUD's going to put out a new funding availability next month, and it could potentially include some funding rules that they tried to implement last year that were blocked by the courts, which reduce how much money you can spend on permanent housing and raises the bar for treatment services. So they're essentially saying, this is how much you're paying on housing right now. This is how much you're paying on treatment. We want to flop those or flip them or find somewhere in between. So put more of an emphasis on treatment services. So this memorandum of understanding was a way to tell the federal government, hey, we're not about housing first. We're in line with the Trump administration, and we want to fund treatment services. But they couldn't get everyone to sign on time. So essentially, the group sent a letter to HUD this week saying, hey, we feel like we failed in this effort. Not everyone signed on, but this MOU, if it does nothing else, it essentially puts everyone's position on record as to where they stand with housing first.
It seems like that's been this ongoing debate, and not just in Spokane, but elsewhere, about, how do you treat the homelessness problem? Do you treat it as a housing problem, or do you treat it as a substance abuse problem? And, there's like you were saying, people who like, oh, let's get them into housing. And then there's others saying, no, we need to get them into treatment. So it's.
Yeah, you could look at homelessness in many different ways. I believe HUD, the federal agency that controls a lot of this funding, they have 10 or 12 different definitions of homelessness that they use. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at it. But when you think of homelessness, there's a considerable amount of the portion of the population that isn't addicted to drugs, doesn't have mental health issues. But those aren't the people that you think of when you think of homelessness. You think of the person that's sitting in the gutter on the side of the street, passed out, potentially overdosing. You think of people holding foil, smoking drugs in the middle of the morning, wrapped in a blanket in a 50-degree weather or less. Those are the cases you think of where it's causing disorder or impacting the public. And that's what this MOU is going after. It's not saying that, hey, there's someone homeless, they don't use drugs, but we need to put them in treatment. They're saying, look, when you think of homelessness, this is the population you think of. Yes, we want to get people into housing, but if you're homeless because you're addicted to drugs, then you need to get into treatment. And that's essentially what this MOU
Yeah.
is saying.
I think what's also interesting is that this expectation, and you can debate it, but the fact that taxpayers are the ones expected to pay for this stuff. And so it would seem like what taxpayers think matters, because they're the ones who are being forced to pay for it, and so they're the ones who should be able to look at it and say, well, what's actually going on? Are we getting the results that we want? And it's interesting how taxpayers, people who are responsible and who are going to work, working jobs, paying their bills, paying taxes, they're having to basically foot the bill for other people's substance abuse. And that it just creates it's not like nonprofits are dealing with this on their own. This isn't like the Red Cross or some charities. This is people going to governments and saying, we want taxpayers to basically cover the cost of dealing with this issue. And so it just really emphasizes the fact that this is the cost of homelessness, whether it's driven by substance or whatever problems. It's concerning to taxpayers because they're the ones who are expected to pay for it. And so the question is, how long are they going to be expected to pay? At what point is the issue going to get solved? Because, man, how many years have we been talking about homelessness in Washington State?
Yeah, and generally when you're asking taxpayers to pay for something, they're going to expect a return on their investment. And that's hard to do in situations with Housing First, where there's no preconditions for sobriety and treatment, especially if drug use is what's causing them to be homeless at that point. So it's a difficult position to be in for taxpayers. I get maybe Housing First is more compassionate. And yeah, ideally it's designed where you have all these support services around you. There's opportunities for these people to participate in treatment. But if you're not requiring them and someone refuses over and over again, you're just forcing the taxpayers to pay for a revolving door where you have these people that are getting subsidized housing.
Right.
And then they're overdosing on the street. And then you have emergency responders coming there with an ambulance. Then they're going into the ambulance. Then they're going into the jail. It's a lot of money. It's not just the housing. It's everything else that goes with it.
It just creates this weird situation because, I go to buy alcohol. I got to show an ID, right? We are big about not selling alcohol to minors. Cigarettes to minors. They have all these regulations around cigarette marketing. You can't use certain colors because they're associated with kids. But then they turn and see if if fentanyl is your preferred poison, you're going to get subsidized. You're going to have people giving you detoxing, that overdose medicine or whatever. You're literally going to have people pamper you. And I think that's the other issue is, when dealing with, they call it homelessness, but the question is, why are they homeless? And if the issue is that they're a drug addict, it really does raise the question of what message are we sending by how we're dealing with this? Because what it's basically saying is, hey, you can don't work a job, get addicted to fentanyl, and someone else is going to take care of you and cover the cost. That taxpayers will pay for your life. And if you overdose, there will be people there to make sure that you get the medicine you need, and you're not held accountable to anybody. That could be a really tempting prospect for somebody who's living on hard times, right? So there's that's the other thing that's going on, is what message is being conveyed by how taxpayers are being forced to address what they call homelessness. But what in many cases are people who are, they don't have a home because they're addicted to fentanyl or some other drug. So,
yeah. And it begs the question. I mean, if you're homeless, obviously you don't have a place to stay generally at night, but putting someone in a government subsidized or taxpayer subsidized housing unit, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue of what's making them homeless. And it begs the question, what's worse? Is it dying on the street because you're addicted to fentanyl and you couldn't overcome your addiction by participating in treatment? Or is it worse to die in a government subsidized housing unit alone? Because generally you're in the same
Right.
situation either way.
Right. Well, Tim, we appreciate your coverage on this. And if the past is any indication, this issue is not going away anytime soon. So listeners can keep up with this story and others at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thank you for listening to this episode of Washington in Focus.
So check out the story and more at thecentersquare.com/Washington. That's a wrap on this week's episodes of Washington in Focus Daily. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.